Hello and welcome to our webcast. Moss Adams is pleased that you joined us for today's webcast, Risk Management for Mission-Driven Boards. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief video.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. Moss Adams webcasts are designed to help elevate your business performance. Transform your future for the better with advisory solutions tailored to your vision and supported by our collective technical resources. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% or 3 of the 4 polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. Polling questions will appear within the slide window. To participate in the polls, please click on your answer and be sure to hit the Submit button to record your response. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry, if you can't download your CPE certificate today, we'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet to receive credit. The attendance sheet is available in our slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit only can be awarded to participants registered as themselves, and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And now I would like to introduce today's presenters. Tammy Lohr, Director, and Maria Stroth, Senior Manager here at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your console if you would like more information. Now, I'd like to kick the floor over to Tammy to get the presentation started. Tammy.
Great. Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you all for joining. As Danielle said, I'm Tammy Lohr. I'm a director in our Strategy and Operations Consulting Group, and I focus on internal audit, performance audit, efficiency and effectiveness work, fraud prevention and detection, and of course, risk management services, primarily for our government and our education clients. And I've been doing this risk-based work for about a decade now, and it seems to me more important than ever to have a strong risk management program, just given the level of uncertainty that exists in the world today. So we're really excited that you're here. We hope that you'll find this information either helpful if you already have a risk management program, or inspiring if you are just starting to think about implementing one. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tammy, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here as well. I work with Tammy and also have areas of expertise in enterprise risk management, performance and internal audit, organizational and operational assessments, and process improvement. And I primarily serve organizations in the public and social sectors, including local, state, tribal governments, as well as not-for-profits and foundations and higher education. Back to you, Tammy.
Great. All right. So this is the first webcast in a series of webcasts that Moss Adams is hosting that's focused on building better boards for these government, tribal, nonprofit, foundation, and education clients that we serve. So we wanted to be able to highlight that here. We have some other really exciting webcasts coming up that focus on fundraising and development, the use of AI and strategic planning. So feel free to go on our website and make sure that you also register for those. And today we'll be covering some of the fundamental principles of risk management and how to apply them in your organization. We'll share some practical tools that you can use to help identify and assess risks that impact your organization's mission and your operations. And then we'll talk about how to actually integrate risk management into your work and into your culture over time. As you'll hear us say several times throughout today's presentation, risk management at its core really is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time task or sort of a check-the-box activity, but something that continues to happen on an ongoing basis. So we have our very first polling question. We wanted to get started with just gauging who it is we have in the audience today and the current state of your organization's risk management. So is your approach really robust and well integrated? Is it strong but somewhat disconnected? Is it a little patchwork, or is it still undefined? So we want to hear from all of you. And I think for me and what I see with clients is that we usually are coming in at sort of the C or the D level, right? You don't usually hire a consultant when you have really strong risk management practices. So that's maybe a little bit of Maria and my bias. But we are seeing more and more organizations be very interested in establishing a risk management program because we've had so many sort of whiplash events over the last 5 or so years that have really impacted our ability to think about what is normal in our organizations. Make sure you get your response into this polling question. Looks like we've got about 75% of you who have responded. So I'll give it just another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move on so that we can talk about risk. Yeah, Danielle, you want to jump in?
Yeah, for those of you that are having trouble with your polling questions, a few things that you can do to try to help. We can refresh your screen. Typically, if you've closed your slides or made them a little bit smaller, you may not be able to see them either. So there's a little widget at the bottom of your screen, and if you click on that, it should open up your slides. You should be able to see the responses. We'll open it up for just a few more seconds here, and don't worry, there's 3 more coming that you'll be able to respond to. And we'll push it to the results.
All right. Well, it looks like half of you have some pretty strong risk management processes in place already, which is fantastic. And so we hope that you can find some of the information that we're covering today to be helpful to help you make that program really more robust. And then for everyone else, I hope that you can take something away so that you can start this program for yourselves. All right. I'm going to pass it over to Maria to talk about understanding risk.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to get us started just talking a little bit foundationally about what risk is and what enterprise risk management is. So people often think about and define risk differently depending on what your background is, what sort of training you've had, your professional experience. There could be a lot of different ways to sort of think about risk. For the purposes of thinking about enterprise risk management and this presentation, we're defining risk as the potential for loss or harm that could impact your organization's ability to achieve its goals. So basically, these are the things, the events that could get in your way of being able to achieve what you're trying to achieve as an organization. Some risks are small and some risks can be really big and major, but there are 3 characteristics that we often think about that impact how important a risk is to pay attention to in your organization. So that's uncertainty, impact, and likelihood. When we think about uncertainty, any level of risk, any risk that we can identify involves unknown outcomes that can affect your organization's performance. And this uncertainty can stem from a lot of different factors, things like market fluctuations, changes in regulations, operational challenges that may be occurring internally, maybe with turnover, high levels of turnover, or just challenges with your systems or processes or those sorts of things that can impact your organization's ability to achieve your goals. So uncertainty is sort of kind of what risk is, right? It's that sort of feeling of just not really knowing about how things are going to impact our organization. You'll often hear terms impact and likelihood when you're thinking about risk as two ways to sort of measure the significance of risk. So when we think about impact, that could be something that's sort of a minor inconvenience in your organization to something really significant, like a financial loss or reputational damage, which are two areas that we're sort of seeing as significant risk areas for organizations like yours today. And understanding the potential impact or consequence of a risk is really important for your risk management practices because you can't manage every risk, right? So being able to understand this is all of our risks and these are the ones that are the most impactful potentially to our organization is a really important way to be able to prioritize your risks and focus on the ones that are likely to have the most or the highest impact on your ability to achieve your objectives in your organization. And then likelihood is thinking about sort of the probability that a risk is going to occur. So assessing how likely that risk is going to occur, which can also help you prioritize the risks that need the most immediate attention. Okay, so that's sort of high level what risk is and some of the key factors of risk. Bringing that up into enterprise risk management and how you manage your risks. When we're thinking about ERM, we're thinking about understanding the risks your organization faces and then having a sustainable and repeatable process to monitor and mitigate those risks. So Tammy promised we would say this a lot. This is not a one-time process. ERM is really meant to be a continuous cycle of assessment and evaluation that you do and that allows you to adapt on a regular basis to the risks that are facing your organization. So for instance, and this is a common thing we see with nonprofit organizations and other mission-driven organizations is that as regulations change or as shifts in your community needs change, your risk profile is likely to be changing. And so an ERM program can allow you to regularly look at those risks and adjust your organizational strategies to be able to manage those risks and ensure that you're able to continue to be resilient and continue to be responsive to your community's needs. I also want to note that risk management ideally involves staff at all levels of your organization in the identification, assessment, and mitigation of risks. So that includes your board who oversees risks, your senior management team who has sort of overall responsibility, but also all of the staff in your organization who in their day-to-day work are likely to see and be exposed to potential risks that face your organization. I was recently working with a community foundation that had been talking about risk in their organization as it related to their grant portfolio and the grants that they were giving out to the community. And because of those conversations and because of the way they involved their teams at all levels in risk management discussions, someone had identified a really risky grant application, which did turn out to be a fraudulent application and was able to keep the organization from unintentionally giving dollars away to a fraudulent organization. So again, having sort of everyone involved can be really impactful in your organization. And then risk management, again, is meant to support your organization's objectives. That's a really key piece of risk management. You want to make sure it's tailored toward and sort of working toward helping you make sure you can achieve your objectives. So it's really important to understand what is our mission? What are our goals? What are we trying to do here? And then thinking about what are all the various different risks that could come up that could impact those goals. And, an example of this is if we have sort of financial uncertainty, maybe there's a key partner who provides funding to us as an organization, and we're at risk of losing funding from that partner. When we've identified that as a risk to our mission, to our goals, then we can start to identify strategies to mitigate that risk, which can be really impactful in your ability to sort of do what you're trying to do as an organization. You're not reacting to a situation, right? You're sort of strategically positioning yourself for success in the long term, which is really the value of ERM. Which is the perfect segue into this slide. We care about ERM because it supports your organization's success. Also, funders and donors are increasingly looking for organizations that demonstrate really strong governance and really strong risk management practices. So having a program in place where you identify, assess, and mitigate those key risks to your organization is a really good way to demonstrate to your community that you're doing the right things to increase the sustainability and resilience of your organization. ERM can also help you sustain your organization in a rapidly changing environment. So Tammy sort of alluded to this in the beginning. We are seeing organizations really starting to think about risk management more and more right now and trying to get those robust programs in place, especially because we've seen over the last 5 years how quickly our environments can change and how much those sort of changes in the market and the economy, whatever it may be, in regulations can really impact our operations and our ability to achieve our mission, right? So having a program in place like this can really help you to be adaptable and a little bit more flexible and just a little bit more prepared in the face of those regular changes. And then the other thing here is that it's really integral to achieving your mission. So again, you can really focus on delivering your programs effectively, delivering your services effectively. You can really think about how can we be really aligned to our mission when you have your risks effectively managed, because you're not always sort of responding to a fire or sort of trying to address the next thing that's a major challenge for your organization, because you're able to be a little bit more proactive and strategic when you have a really robust enterprise risk management program in place. These are some of the common risk areas that we are seeing in 2025 in mission-driven organizations that we're working with. Financial risk is a really big one here, especially because we do see a lot of organizations that would love to have a more diverse funding portfolio, a more diverse revenue portfolio, but maybe don't. And we're seeing challenges with many of the funding streams that governments, nonprofits, higher education institutions, all organizations in the public and social sector have. There are threats to those funding streams right now. And so thinking about financial risk and how to sort of mitigate against it, make your portfolio as diverse, as resilient as it possibly can be when you're thinking about your revenue streams is really critical for organizations right now. And that really ties to impact risk. And so we're seeing organizations really focused on thinking about events that could negatively impact their initiatives, their projects, their grants. And a lot of times that can be financial, but it might be something else. I think, for instance, if you've designed a program based on community needs at the time, this is a common thing that we see, and then community needs sort of change, then that program may not be relevant or effective anymore, right? So that's a risk to your program. So really being able to think about what risks there are to your programs, to your initiatives is another key area that we're seeing organizations like yours focused on. Another common impact risk that we're seeing lately is related to unanticipated barriers to access. So a program could see or encounter unforeseen barriers that could prevent target populations from accessing their services. So if you're a nonprofit, for example, and you provide job training services, transportation issues, for example, could significantly impact the ability of participants to access those services. And so that's an example of thinking about impact risk in your organization. The other one I'll highlight here is operational risk. These are any events that could block your ability to achieve your mission due to challenges or failed human resources, procedures, systems, policies, anything sort of internally that's impacting your ability to achieve your goals and your objectives. Oftentimes we're seeing things like staff turnover right now, or challenges with vacancy rates, since we're hiring the right people into the organization is where we're seeing this show up a lot, as well as with inadequate systems. That can be a major challenge for organizations when we have systems that just aren't working for us or meeting our needs, or they're not integrating well together. And so we end up with a lot more manual processes. We end up with higher risk of error, those sorts of things, if our systems aren't working really effectively for us. So there's, of course, some other risk areas here. I won't go into all of them in the interest of time. And I am going to go ahead and get us to our next polling question here. Which risk do you think is the highest for your organization in 2025? Impact risk, reputational risk, operational risk, governance, financial, or external risk? And we're definitely seeing key risks in all of these areas. So as I certainly mentioned before, financial risk is just where people seem to be really focused right now. That's such a critical area, and really impacts all of these risk areas here, and our ability to provide strong services, programs, have strong operations, manage our reputation, all of those things. And reputational risk as well, just thinking about how do we make decisions in this complex environment that we're all faced with this day and age, and make sure that those decisions align with who we want to present ourselves as in the community. Okay, it looks like we have about 90%. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of folks highlighting operational risk. It is pretty split across the different categories here, which isn't too surprising. Okay. I'll go ahead and pass it to Tammy to talk more about some frameworks and tools related to risk management.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's get started with some frameworks. So Maria and I have both said it, but I'll say it again. Enterprise risk management is not a one and done activity. It's something that your organization should be doing on a continuous basis. And this slide outlines the 4 key steps in the ERM lifecycle. So the first step is just to identify your risks. You want to recognize potential risks that could affect your operations, your financials, your reputation, compliance concerns, and ultimately your ability to achieve your mission. So I'll use the example of a higher education institution that's facing a budget deficit due to declining student enrollment, something that I know a lot of my clients are dealing with. So in this identify step, that institution would be looking at demographic shifts, increased competition from other institutions or online programs, or even changes in student preferences. So maybe they don't want to go to a traditional 4-year college, they're going to a 2-year college, or they're going straight into the workforce. So by identifying these risks early, that institution can then explore potential solutions to help mitigate that risk. Then once the risks are identified, the next step is to assess. And that's where you're going to try to understand what's driving the risk and what are the potential consequences of this risk. So if we're sticking with our higher education institution, they would be looking at, application trends, student recruitment activities, student retention rates, financial projections, to really try to determine how severe and impactful that deficit will be. So understanding the cause of the risk as well as the impact. And then from there, you'll move on to responding and managing risk. And that's where you're going to be developing strategies to mitigate the risk, accept the risk, transfer the risk, or avoid it altogether. So some responses from institutions in our higher education institution example could be, well, we want to expand our online course offerings, or we want to start online course offerings. We want to enhance our recruitment efforts. We want to build partnerships with high schools. We want to diversify our revenue streams through private donations or grant funding. So those are some of the strategies to help potentially mitigate that risk. I say that, and I also understand that it's a lot easier said than done, but just acknowledging some potential examples there. And then the final step in the ERM lifecycle is to be able to monitor and report. So how are we keeping an eye on this risk? and are our mitigation actions actually working? Here, that institution would be continually tracking enrollment, its financial projections, its other revenue streams, so it can adjust its strategies as needed. So understand what strategies are working, what strategies are not working, where do we need to pivot. And this is where that regular reporting to the board can really help ensure transparency and also enables more proactive decision making. So really, the goal with this life cycle is to be able to proactively identify and mitigate risks that are occurring on an ongoing basis throughout just your day-to-day work. So then moving on to an ERM framework, these are some of the practical and manageable tasks that you can do at your organization to really set up an ERM framework. So we've helped organizations get these frameworks set up, and I know that it can be a helpful way just to get your program off the ground in a way that feels sustainable, where it's not overloading staff. So first, we start with defining really clear policies and procedures, and then assigning roles and responsibilities. And that can sound like an overwhelming task, but it doesn't have to be. Your policies and procedures can really just outline what is your approach to ERM. This is what we're looking at. This is how we're going to operationalize it. And then we'll move into defining roles and responsibilities. That's between the board, the leadership team, managers, and staff, so that it's really well understood how each person or each group really contributes to that process, so that everyone knows their role and that they're sort of bought into this program. And since this webcast is part of the Better Board series, I'll go on a little soapbox right here on how the board really plays a crucial role in overseeing your organization's risk framework, making sure that it aligns with those strategic objectives, and making sure that management is held accountable for proactively identifying and mitigating risks. Ultimately, your board should be establishing your organization's risk tolerance. So that's, what do we think is an acceptable level of risk? Maria's going to talk about how you can do that a little bit later. The board is also responsible for oversight of the ERM program. So they should be reviewing reports by management to assess emerging risks and how those risks are being managed. So for example, if a nonprofit organization is facing funding uncertainties, the board may require regular financial risk reports and sort of updates on alternative fundraising strategies and how effective those are being at helping to mitigate this financial risk. So the board's role is really to provide the strategic oversight of the program, while management is responsible for actually doing the activities and going through that ERM lifecycle that we just reviewed on a regular basis, usually on a quarterly basis. So to build this ERM framework, we also recommend having some training and awareness building in place. Providing training sessions and education just helps everyone better understand the purpose and the importance of the ERM program, so it doesn't feel like it's just another thing that we have to do, but rather sort of understanding that this is going to be built into our culture, and we're raising that risk awareness so that people feel more empowered to be able to identify and address those risks proactively. As part of your framework, you should also have some risk management tools and processes so that this can go from sort of a conceptual discussion and program to a really hands-on program with tangible things that people can interact with. And we'll be talking about some of those tools that you're welcome to adapt in that next session. But just as a preview, implementing things like risk registers or risk assessments can help you track and manage your risks without creating too much complexity within the process. And those tools can be flexible and adaptable to fit your organization's size and needs. And then finally, as with any process, you want to regularly review and adjust your framework to make sure that it continues to meet your organization's needs over time. All right, let's talk about some risk management tools. Today, we'll be going over 3 commonly used tools. The first is enterprise risk assessments. I'll call them ERAs. The second is risk registers. And then we have some options to present for you if you want to do a program or a project-specific risk assessment. So we're going to start out by talking about enterprise risk assessments. And these are a great tool to help organizations identify, analyze, and respond to risks really effectively. These assessments are particularly helpful in today's uncertain world, and when they're done right, they provide a systematic, holistic, and strategic approach to risk management. ERAs are systematic in the sense that they follow a very structured approach to identifying risks rather than just sort of feeling things out or recognizing a risk after it's maybe too late to actually implement some mitigation, and you're sort of managing the fallout of that risk. When our team does these ERAs for clients, we're using the COSO ERM framework that essentially provides a structured approach to managing risks by integrating them into governance, strategy, and performance. And like Maria and I have said, a lot of the examples that we're using so far are financial, but really these assessments have a much broader set of risks that we're looking at. And that takes us to the next attribute of an ERA, which is that it's very holistic. So an effective ERA doesn't look at risks in isolation, but they're looking at a lot of different types of risks like operations, finance, strategy, governance, compliance, human resources, management, and that's all helping better understand where are some potential vulnerabilities. When we're doing these assessments, we're looking at between 18 to 20 different categories of risk, depending on your organization type, if you're a school district or a nonprofit. And so by taking that approach, we're able to highlight a number of key risks so that we're not sort of sidetracked and we're just focusing on one key risk, such as finance, while ignoring other potential upcoming issues. So really making sure that we are applying focus to all of the areas that are considered high risk in our organization. And by having this holistic and systematic assessment where really no stone is left unturned, your organization is better able to use those results more strategically. So really the purpose of this assessment isn't just to identify those risks, but it's to inform decision-making, to be able to prioritize what you're going to spend time working on and be proactively managing some key threats. So if we have a government agency and they're doing emergency response, their risk assessment may show that climate change is increasing the likelihood of natural disasters. Well, that agency may then choose to prioritize investments in infrastructure and emergency preparedness measures out in the community proactively so that the risk of natural disasters, meaning the risk on the community that's experiencing that natural disaster, is mitigated before things become a crisis. Of course, by their nature, natural disasters are a crisis, but how do we mitigate that impact on the community that we're serving? That's what a risk assessment can help start to point out for you. So we have an example from one of our reports here that's been scrubbed of client data that you can look at. So when we're doing our enterprise risk assessment, we're looking at some of the things that Maria's already talked about. So what is the impact of an adverse event? What is the likelihood that an event will occur? How prepared is our organization to be able to react if that event were to happen? And is that overall risk level increasing, decreasing, or flat? These are, again, just elements from the COSO ERM framework that our team uses for ERAs. So what we do is we look at each risk category according to those 4 areas, and then that informs the overall risk rating for that category. So as you can see in this example, we have IT and cybersecurity that are rated as high risk. This can have a really big impact on an organization. So its impact rating is high. It's moderately likely, but the organization here has a low to moderate preparedness. So maybe they haven't done cybersecurity training. Maybe they haven't done penetration testing. Maybe they haven't taken some of those steps to proactively identify where their risks are here. And then because of that, also their risk trajectory is increasing. We all know cybersecurity incidents are generally increasing. So all of that information then feeds into why this category is considered high risk. And then take that in comparison to the HR category, which is low risk. Well, it's kind of interesting because the impact of HR is rated as high. So you might think, oh, impact is high, it should be a higher risk area. But it has a lower likelihood, and the organization is showing that it's prepared, that it knows what to do if something goes awry in HR. So because of this high level of preparedness, that decreasing trajectory, and that lower likelihood, the HR category is ranked as low, whereas the IT and cybersecurity category is ranked as high. So we just wanted to be able to sort of share that example with you all today, that some of the things that are high impact don't necessarily mean high risk, but there's things that you can be doing to help mitigate that potential risk. All right, let's move on to risk registers. A lot of our clients develop a risk register after doing an enterprise risk assessment, because that assessment gives them a starting point to build their register off of. So if you're not already familiar, a risk register is a structured tool, usually a trusty Excel spreadsheet, and it's used to document, track, and manage risks within your organization. It's usually a centralized space and record of potential risk areas, their likelihood, their impact, and then the strategies that are in place to be able to mitigate those risks. So risk registers typically include information like the nature of the risk, who's the risk owner, who's responsible for risk mitigation, do we have response plans, and then providing status updates directly in that spreadsheet. And these risk registers, again, not a one-time exercise, but really an ongoing tool that's used throughout the ERM lifecycle. So they help organizations continuously monitor those risks. Those risks are always changing, they're always evolving. And so this is a great way to be able to capture that. In this tool, you can update your mitigation strategies, and you can use it as a leadership team to help make data-driven decisions about what you're going to be focusing on, so that something that's important doesn't necessarily fall by the wayside. Usually we'll see these types of tools used in quarterly leadership meetings or board meetings, because it just provides an update on where things are at so that you can keep working on reducing overall risk. And because these registers provide a really nice overview of an organization's complete risk landscape, they, again, help create that informed decision making. So as a leader, you would be better able to prioritize where people are going to be spending their time, how are we going to be allocating our resources, and really work on enhancing your organization's resilience through the use of this tool. So we have a sample skeleton risk register here that you could use as a template just to get this work going in your organization if you wanted. So you can see this is a spreadsheet. It lists your risk category, description of that specific risk that's identified, the risk rating attributed to the risk, a great way to sort of sort, and so that you're only focusing on some of those higher level risks in those discussions that you have, who the risk manager or the owner is, what's currently being done to mitigate that risk, and what's planned to be done in the future to be able to mitigate that risk as well. So you can have risk managers or risk owners update these areas. Again, it's usually once a quarter, so that you're able to report on progress and see what else is influencing each potential risk area. Okay, so if you have just a program or a project that you want to assess risk on, there's a few different tools that you could use for that. The ERAs and the risk registers that we just talked about, those are really designed to look at risk across the entire organization and get that really full and complete picture, whereas the tools that we'll cover here are helpful for more targeted or specific assessments of risk. So first we have internal audits. These can be used as targeted reviews of our processes and our procedures to make sure that risks, particularly financial and operational risks, are being well managed. And these audits provide an objective evaluation of internal controls, of performance, of different ways of doing things to be able to help identify where do we have weaknesses and where do we have opportunities for improvement. So for an example, an internal audit could reveal inefficiencies in our grant reporting processes. Well, that means that we can address those reporting processes before they escalate into larger issues with our funders. You could also do scenario planning, and that's a proactive approach to anticipate future events and prepare strategies for dealing with the uncertain outcomes that may occur with those different events. So this is really helpful for looking at programmatic or financial areas where conditions are changing rapidly. So we're saying, okay, we think that these are likely scenarios. This is the impact it would have on our organization. This is how we would react. So you can look at those different scenarios and sort of build a little bit of a playbook to understand what would we do in this instance. And the scenarios that you outline may not be exactly what actually happens in the future, but you're probably going to get pretty close. And then you're going to be able to sort of say, okay, we've thought this through. This is our next course of action. This is what we're going to do to mitigate this risk proactively. And this is how we're going to be able to increase our resilience given this different impact. So if we're looking at, changes in funding sources, shifts in community needs, some of those examples that Maria has talked about, we can develop those flexible strategies that allow us to respond really effectively, regardless of what that future holds. And then the final option that we'll talk about today is due diligence assessments. And these are really key when you're selecting grantees or partners in an initiative. So these types of assessments help us evaluate potential risks by looking at compliance, looking at what is their financial health, and then making sure that we have good alignment with our values and our mission for any partners that we're bringing on board. So we're going to talk about scaling. So how do you know how much risk assessment is right for your organization? I would love to say that there's never too much risk assessment, but I think that there actually is such a thing as too much risk assessment because you don't want to do so much that you're not actually doing the work of your organization. So these are some of the considerations that we want to share with you, especially if you're a smaller organization. Your organization's size will really help determine what this program should look like. Smaller organizations can have simplified processes. You can have informal risk discussions. You can use the risk register tool to be able to sort of keep track of some of those items. Whereas larger and more complex organizations do tend to have more formal risk assessments and documented processes that are sort of behind those. So we should also think about what resources do you have in your organization to dedicate to this? And that includes staff and budget and technology to be able to implement the risk management strategies effectively. So for instance, those smaller teams, those smaller organizations, you can just use trusty Excel for that risk tracking, whereas larger organizations, you might have specialized risk management software. And then finally, what's most important, regardless of your organization's size, is that you're rooting this work in your organization's mission, and you're focusing on areas that will have the most impact on your ability to achieve your goals. So if your organization's mission emphasizes community engagement, you want to make sure your risk assessment is focusing on areas that could affect community trust and involvement. So just bring it back to your mission. Anytime that you feel like we're sort of creeping away, bring it back to what's our mission, what are we trying to achieve, and for who. Okay, and we have got a polling question now, third polling question. So we want to hear from you on what you think your organization would benefit from. Would you want an enterprise risk assessment, a risk register, a specific project or program assessment, or do you already have these in place? And I think that based on the first polling question, I think you might have some responses for number D, letter D. D is not a number. All right, and we also have a question from the audience. For a nonprofit organization, do you recommend having a risk management board committee to evaluate common areas of risk? How does the board best elevate the concern about risk in a meaningful way? So if you're sitting on a board of a nonprofit, I think saying to management, we really want to get an ERM program started up. We're interested in this. A great starting point would be that they conduct an enterprise risk assessment. They can contract that out. They can do it internally. But depending on the size, you might want a formal assessment or just the development of that risk register. And then we usually see audit and risk committees sort of lead a lot of this work. So we're often working with audit committees in order to sort of present the results of these assessments and then help with some of that ongoing risk management work. And so that would be the opportunity is to, if you have an audit committee already, I would say add this to their purview and then have annual updates to the full board is our recommendation. Okay, great. About 28% of you say an ERA would be great. And then 40% of you have these already. Incredible. Awesome. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Maria.
Thank you, Tammy. Okay, I am excited to talk about one of my favorite topics as it relates to enterprise risk management, which is risk appetite, and thinking about what our risk appetite statement is in an organization. And the reason I think this is so important is because it's a tangible thing you can do in your organization that can really help support decision-making strategically in your organization, both about risk, but also sort of about your strategy and just how you make decisions about how to move forward. So what is risk appetite? It's generally defined as the amount of risk you are willing to take on in pursuit of a value or your organizational goals. And again, understanding risk appetite can be really helpful in terms of helping your leadership team and your staff and your board make really smart decisions about what risks are worth taking on and which should be avoided. And it really provides, I guess, a clear approach to managing uncertainty. It can help you build trust with your stakeholders, and it really can help you move in the right direction. Even within the same industry, it's common for different organizations to have different risk appetites, and that's totally fine. In fact, even within a singular organization, it can be common to have different risk appetites depending on the area of operation, which is also great. And we'll look at an example of that in a minute. So if we have organization A that has a high risk appetite when it comes to supporting grassroots organizations or movements with a proven track record of success, that organization may also have a low risk appetite when it comes to financial reporting. So based on their mission, it's more important to fund initiatives that may or may not succeed than it is to restrict funding from these small grassroots type groups. And in that way, they have a high risk tolerance built into sort of their theory of change as an organization and what they're trying to achieve. But they might have, again, a very low risk appetite when it comes to financial reporting, which means generally the organization is more cautious in terms of its processes in this area and may have a higher number of staff supporting this area so that we're less likely to encounter issues as it relates to financial reporting. So this is an example of where we can have both a high risk appetite and a low risk appetite related to two different parts of the organization, and we can pull that together to guide the way that our organization thinks about how it accepts or avoids risks. There's a really wide range of acceptable risk appetites. And I do, really want to emphasize that just because an organization has a high risk appetite, that doesn't necessarily make that organization better or worse than any other organization. It really needs to be aligned with your organization's circumstances and what you're trying to achieve. So these 6 factors are some of the things that you can sort of think about as you think about your organization's specific circumstances and what your risk appetite might be. So if you have a more aggressive growth strategy, if you're sort of in a place of your organization's evolution where you are trying to be really innovative and grow really quickly, you may have a higher risk appetite, and that might make a lot of sense. Whereas if you have kind of more conservative goals, you're sort of happy with where things are and trying to sustain and maintain that, you might have a little bit more risk avoidance or just less risk appetite at this point in time. And it's important to note that your risk appetite can and probably will change over time, depending on how your goals and your strategies evolve over time. And that really gets back to why it's so important to keep your risk management processes aligned with your goals and your organization mission at the time that you're sort of operating within. Liability exposure. So projects with higher potential liabilities might warrant a more cautious risk appetite, which makes a lot of sense, right? If we're taking on a project or a program that creates liabilities for us, we might want to be more cautious. This can be really common if you are like a fiscal sponsor, nonprofit, or an organization that provides funding to other organizations, when we really want to be thinking about something like liability exposure. Leadership and culture. Your leadership's attitude toward risk and the overall sort of organizational culture around risk plays a really significant role in determining how much risk that your organization is willing to accept. So you may have sort of a really risk-averse culture, a risk-averse sort of leadership team, and that's fine. That might lead to a lower risk appetite. Organizations with strong financial stability might have a higher tolerance for risk. If you feel really secure in your funding streams, you have a diverse revenue portfolio, you have some wiggle room maybe to take on some higher risks. Whereas if you have more limited resources, it can be likely that you might want to minimize some of those risks and take on a little bit less. Legal obligations can, of course, impact your risk appetite. So how important is compliance to your organization and sort of the mission and objectives and goals that you have? What kind of requirements are in place that impact your operations? That can certainly impact the level of risk appetite that you take on. And then, of course, stakeholder expectations and reputation management. So we want to be thinking about what are the preferences and risk tolerance of key stakeholders as we're defining our risk appetite. Okay, quick polling question before I wrap up this section. So overall, I would characterize my organization's risk appetite as high. We accept a lot of risk inherent in our operations. Moderate, we accept some risk, but we try to be thoughtful. Or low, we are wary of possible risks. And again, no right answer or wrong answer here. Totally depends on your organization's circumstances at this point in time.
Maria, while we're waiting for this, there's a couple questions in our Q&A. How about this? Is there a number of risks we should seek to have in our risk register? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't necessarily recommend targeting a specific number. Like Tammy mentioned earlier, we generally see sort of about 18 to 20 overall risk categories when we're working with organizations, but that's just sort of a guideline and what we've seen. I think really it's about coming to a place where your entire leadership team of your organization feels like all of the risks are represented. Do we feel comfortable about this list of risks? Do we think anything significant is missing? Do we think we need to add anything? That's a really good way to think about it. It can be helpful to sort of categorize your risks into overall categories, which is what we do when we get to sort of that 18 to 20 categories in many of our enterprise-wide risk assessments, just to help manage it, right? So that's something to sort of think about, is what's going to be manageable for our organization. But really it's going to be the risk rating and your ability to prioritize risks that's going to be most important, as opposed to the number of risks specifically. Great question. Okay, let's see the results here. So about 60% in that moderate area. I think that's great, what we would expect to see. I would love to talk more about the folks here in this high risk appetite area, just to sort of see where your organization is going. Probably some exciting times in your organization, so that's great. Okay, so if you're looking to define a risk appetite statement, this is sort of a process that you can take to do that. You want to start with defining your organizational objectives. So clarifying what are your long and short-term goals, and this will help guide you in determining how much risk you're willing to take in your organization to be able to achieve those goals. You want to evaluate your financial capacity. So think about, what is our financial strength? What is our ability to absorb a potential loss or a setback if we do take on a risk and it doesn't go so well, because that directly impacts the amount of risk that you're able to take on. You want to gather input from board members, leadership, key stakeholders on their perspectives and their comfort levels regarding risk, and you want to ensure alignment in those conversations with your organization's mission. I know Tammy and I kind of keep going back to that because that's so critical for ERM. You want to think about regulatory requirements, industry standards, external conditions like the economy, market conditions that could influence the level of risk that you're willing to take on. You want to look at past and historical risk tolerance. So look at past decisions, look at past successes, past failures. Try to understand how have risks been managed in the past and were they managed well? And try to understand, has the organization shown a pattern of more sort of conservatism as it relates to risk appetite or being a little bit more bold as it relates to taking on risk? And again, both of those can be the right choice for your organization, but sort of looking at that historically can be a really important input into your development of a risk appetite statement. And then you want to take those different pieces that we just talked through there, those top 4 pieces, and use that to create your risk appetite statement. So you're really formalizing a clear statement that outlines acceptable risk across the different parts of your organization to guide decision making. So this is an example of a risk appetite statement, which I'll just read really quickly because I think it's so helpful. As a nonprofit organization, we enable innovative and impactful projects while prioritizing the careful management of legal, financial, and reputational risks. We have a low tolerance for risks related to legal compliance, financial mismanagement, and reputational harm, ensuring strict adherence to regulatory requirements, strong financial oversight, and protection of our public image. In contrast, we are open to higher risks in programmatic activities that push boundaries in social change, as long as thorough due diligence is conducted. Our risk appetite is moderate to high, meaning we are willingly accept a certain level of risk to enable projects that align with our mission, provided that these risks are proactively identified. So this, you can see how this is fairly high level, and it could be used by a leadership team when making policy decisions, process decisions, or even strategic decisions. And it really can help to guide how we make those decisions with a consistent approach. And it's also really helpful to ensure that you're thinking about risk when you're making decisions, which is another reason why I think it's so great. Okay, this is our last section, just a couple minutes here before we wrap up. And this is just a few things, key practices related to ERM. We've talked about a lot of this today, so I won't go into it in a lot of detail. You really want to align ERM with your overall mission and values. You want to make sure there's a strong culture around risk awareness. So this is things like providing training, having discussions, including all staff in these discussions, and encouraging open communication about risk and risk management. You, of course, want to monitor and evaluate your risks continuously, establish process for continuous monitoring of risks. This could be things like regular check-ins, quarterly board reporting, annual board reporting, like Tammy mentioned, those sorts of things. Having key performance indicators in place to really assess the effectiveness of your operations and your risk management practices. You want to engage leadership and governance, and you of course want to have commitment from leadership to prioritize risk management and make sure that the board is overseeing risk management. And as Tammy mentioned, that they're making sure management is accountable for identifying, assessing, and most importantly, mitigating those identified risks. And then developing contingency plans. So what are those things that you have in place to reduce risks? Tammy mentioned a little bit of this earlier with scenario planning. You might have some contingency planning in place for those high risk areas and develop strategies that can really help you plan for potential crises in the future. Okay, perfect. So I think that wraps up our presentation. We were able to answer some questions throughout the presentation, but I'm going to pass it over to Danielle to wrap us up.
Thank you, Maria and Tammy, for a great presentation today. To our audience, if you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to us as we'd be happy to continue the conversation. You can drop a note in the Q&A window or reach out to Tammy or Maria directly. Their contact information is in your console. If we didn't have time to answer your question during the presentation, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Also, I'd like to draw your attention to the image in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Click this to be taken to more information on our board governance series, and be sure to register for the next webcast, Fundraising and Development Strategies for Boards, which will be May 15th. Hopefully you can join us for that one as well. And if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any trouble downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. Thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you, everybody.